I'm someone who's deeply, deeply concerned about climate change. You touched on it, Brian, with the whole idea that we might actually see much, much larger movements of people. Are there any countries around the world that we're aware of that are taking a more progressive attitude towards things like climate change refugees, people who are already having their countries inundated, like Kiribati, for example? Do we know, is there any movement internationally about, because I'm aware that as it stands, or from what I understand of how it stands, is that the refugee laws that we have internationally were more or less forged in post-war UN, people fleeing political persecution, essentially for people trying to get away from communism, pretty much, that many years out of date now. Do we see any movement on the international stage?
No. The problem is that what we call climate change refugees are not refugees at all under the convention test. Even if they're the last person standing as the island goes under, they would not be regarded as a refugee. What we need to deal with that is either a new convention that directly addresses that problem, alternatively a modification of the Refugee Convention and corresponding changes to domestic law and its definition of refugees, and frankly I don't see that is going to happen. One of the things that I think is worth getting out into the public debate in Australia about that is that while it's predictable that very many people will be displaced by climate change, generally speaking, they will, if it's by rising sea levels, generally speaking, they will move inland rather than move to another country. If it's through changed river flows and consequent drought and famine, they're likely to move within their continent rather than across to other places. That's a little more difficult to pick. But that said, it's sea level rises in the Pacific Islands that present the most probable source of climate change refugees to Australia. Now, I did the numbers on this a while ago, and if you take as a working hypothesis that an island or a country with a population of greater than 20,000 is likely to be big enough that people will be able to move inland rather than having to depart altogether, and if you take a census across the region to see how many islands fall below that threshold and how much their total population is, it looks as though the total likely number of climate change refugees who will float or swim elsewhere when their countries disappear is less than 100,000. Now that's less than 1 year, less than 1/3 of 1 year's migrant intake in Australia. So on purely numerical terms, we actually don't have too much to fear about climate change refugees. In terms of our psychological capability of adopting that, much more difficult.
I'm actually one of those who doesn't like the argument that the Refugee Convention was a post-war instrument and is outdated, etc., because it actually has adapted and now includes, for example, women who are discriminated against, victims of domestic violence, etc., etc. And the courts are starting to recognise, even in our own legislation, it actually says that a person is a refugee if they can't if they don't have a sustainable living. So there is some acceptance of the Refugee Convention being more progressive. But also there are views other than Jane McAdams on the Refugee Convention and on the accessibility of climate change refugees to its protection. And there have been some excellent studies done, particularly around the Middle East and Africa, of the effects of climate change and how these actually come about through political action, through decisions by states. And so quite often what we might call climate change refugees, which might run into the idea of environmental refugees, also runs into the idea of people who are displaced by development. And so you do have so many dodgy states around the world who have, huge dam projects or whatever, or take over grazing lands of ethnic groups for national parks so that Western tourists can go. So the debate is not finished. But Julian's right. I know Graham Hugo in Adelaide, who's a demographer and who's done a study for the Australian government on climate change, and he found that so far most what we might call strictly climate change refugees are moving internally. They'll become what we could call internally displaced persons. And that's another story. I think there are probably other questions just on the refugee issue.
One aspect of Australian xenophobia I find disappointing is our inability to relate to and understand our neighbour Indonesia. So I was very pleased to hear Susan say that Indonesia is relatively open to refugees. Can you tell us more about what we might learn from Indonesia? And not an easy one, because we don't know how to relate to them. But also, have you noticed any changes in Indonesian conduct since President Yudhoyono took over from President Megawati?
I've only had a little direct connection with Indonesia, but I was living in the region in Singapore when the changes came about and have been in Indonesia since. And I think they find our attitude extremely insulting. They just really, but they're very polite publicly to us. Look, Indonesia is just such a huge country with so many problems of its own, so many ethnic groups. But I think there certainly is a political will to do things correctly and to try and work with us.
I'm glad that a couple of you actually know me, because this question may otherwise cast me as the fascist in the room. As you know, or a couple of you know, I've been working for some years in the area of animal, including human rights. And I've been very interested in recent years, looking back on my past career, in philosophising how to achieve the kind of social change that my practical work was not really helping to achieve. A new theory has interested me recently. I think it emanates from a professor of philosophy in India. He talks about social change coming out of society's honour, and that honour is the key to achieving real social change. And he takes examples from foot binding in China to slavery, etc., etc. I know there are other reasons why these things passed into history, well, not entirely, but almost. First, I'd like to ask, do you think that this argument has some validity? And then secondly, on the more fascistic point, does this mean that we are in fact perhaps a little too politically tolerant in allowing ourselves to socialise with and respect the opinions of people who actively support parties that for the last 10 years at least have come up with very dire laws for refugees and all sorts of areas, really? Or do you still believe that it's possible to work within those parties and therefore we should be supporting those who come through? Or should we be green fascists?
Green fascists, yes, vote Greens. Support the Greens.
Support the Greens, yes. I don't know the content of the idea green fascist, so I'd be careful because the second half of it doesn't sit comfortably with me. I do like the idea that honour can be a guiding principle in the formation of policy as well as attitudes and social attitudes. But I think it's probably a reflection of the way social policies are formed. They're formed from the sort of moral norms of the society that throws them up. Honour has diminished as an idea in our society, and I think it's certainly time for it to have a comeback. But there are other philosophical foundations which are also useful in conjunction with it. I did some work recently on the golden rule, you know, the rule that you do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And you know, it's almost universal. All the Abrahamic religions have it. Every other religion I've looked at has it. Most codes of philosophy have it. All expressed in different ways, but ultimately it's the same idea. And of course it comes from the notion of enlightened self-interest. You know, if I treat people the way I want to be treated, then there's an improved chance that I'll be treated the way I want to be treated. I think ultimately, I think to get to the start of your question, ultimately you are asking whether you've been wasting your time given the nature of the society you're trying to change. I don't think you are at all. I just think these things, because they operate at a very fundamental level in society, take quite a while. Think about William Wilberforce. How long was he campaigning before he made his first breakthrough in the abolition of slavery? You know, it was a very long campaign. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when Peter Singer first started championing the idea of animal liberation. It was in the late 60s, and to be honest, most people thought he was a raving lunatic. They really did. And the fact that he's now a mainstream, highly respected philosopher who has got animal liberation established as a respectable idea and is taking that line of thinking further shows that it can be done. And the trick is, just don't give up. Just don't give up. Keep at it all the time. Never give up.
I just want to say one or two things. First of all, the idea of honour being a touchstone in particularly international relations is actually not new. It's been quite a long-term position. It was, for example, Winston Churchill's philosophy, and he talks about it at some length in his writings. But the idea of being a green fascist really worries me. I mean, I've made my choice because I am a member of the Greens and stand with that party, but in any group of people, there are going to be good things and bad things because we've got that in each one of us. And what is important is to be respectful as far as possible and to listen, even when we dangerously disagree, strongly disagree with people. The dialogue often is very valuable. Doesn't mean you have to change your position, but often you can deepen your position through that dialogue. And what often can happen when we know the truth is we don't listen, and we actually have a more stunted understanding of issues and of a wise way forward than we can have in other, if we are prepared to listen and get to what the deeper concerns are that others have that we don't perhaps share.